In February of 1954, the wind wasn't just cold in Korea, it was a physical weapon. It tore through the thin canvas of the tents and stole the warmth right out of your bones. But then, the air shifted. Marilyn Monroe was fighting a fever of 103 degrees in the Korean cold, barely able to stand. Yet she refused the helicopter waiting to fly her to safety. She knew the brutal wind and the rigid general were nothing compared to the quiet heartbreak of the 3 forgotten soldiers who missed her show, and she was prepared to risk everything for them. She stepped out, a tiny glittering beacon in a place designed only for grit and shadow. She was running on almost no sleep, fighting the raw ache in her lungs and the pounding behind her eyes. Every movement was a deliberate act of will against a body that desperately wanted to collapse. This wasn't a movie set. This was an exhaustingly real landscape of ice and frozen mud, and she was utterly alone in it, miles from her Hollywood comfort. Yet, when she looked at the faces of those 20,000 screaming soldiers, she understood why she was there. They weren't cheering for the starlet. They were cheering for a piece of home, a brief, beautiful fantasy to hold against the brutal reality of the front line. For 4 days and 4 nights she performed, giving every ounce of energy she had. When she sang, the whole world stopped for those young men. They forgot the bitter temperatures. They forgot the danger. They just remembered what it felt like to be charmed by something truly beautiful. She was an emotional lifeline, a siren in the snow. But as exhilarating as it was, the toll was immense. She shed 8 pounds during that tour, a terrifying loss for her already fragile frame. She was performing for an ocean of men, but she was sinking fast. Her handlers and the officers in charge watched her with mounting anxiety. She wasn't just sick. She was a logistical nightmare for the command. Every move she made was a risk, drawing attention, requiring protection. She represented millions of dollars in insurance policies and millions more in global desire. This was her mission, to bring joy, but to the generals she was a liability in a $5,000 dress. As her final encore concluded, the weather took a truly dangerous turn. The wind howled like a predator, whipping the snow into a frenzy. The weather report that night wasn't a warning, it was an ultimatum. A massive blizzard was racing toward their remote base, threatening to ground all air traffic for days. Staying was no longer an option. It was a potentially life-threatening gamble. It was then that General Harlan arrived. The general was the antithesis of Marilyn. He was all structure, rules, and clipped efficiency. A man who saw the war in numbers and strategy, not in smiles and heartbreak. He saw her celebrity as a weapon that had unexpectedly turned on the command. He viewed her not as an artist who had boosted the morale of 20,000 fighting men, but as a crisis that needed immediate evacuation. He wanted her out, and he wanted her out now. He gave the order to prepare the helicopter instantly. There would be no time for autographs or final goodbyes. The roar of General Harlan's voice wasn't loud, but it was clipped, precise, and cut through the post-show adrenaline like a shard of ice. "Miss Monroe, you are a security risk." It was an order disguised as a statement of fact, and it was delivered to the world's biggest star as if she were a minor piece of misplaced equipment. He stood stiffly in the flickering light, his uniform starched and immaculate. "The chopper is fueled," he stated, his jaw set. "You are to board immediately. We have a 6-minute window before the worst of the weather hits." Marilyn felt the sting. All the exhaustion, the pain in her throat, and the ache in her bones suddenly felt hollow. "But General," she began, her voice hoarse, "I haven't had a chance to say thank you. I wanted to meet some of the men personally, just a moment or two." General Harlan cut her off, his eyes flashing with irritation. "You are an icon, Miss Monroe, not a social worker. Your celebrity, your feelings are irrelevant to command. The cost of protecting you here is immense. I am citing severe weather, proximity to the operational zone. Your duty is complete. Now you will obey a direct order." He didn't wait for a response. He simply gestured toward the idling helicopter. It was the finality of the command, the explicit dismissal of her heart that truly wounded her. As she trudged across the slick, icy ground toward the chopper, every step felt heavy. She was leaving without having done enough. She kept seeing the glimpse she'd caught a moment ago, the darkened triage tent at the edge of the base cut off from the main lights and the roar of celebration. Inside that small, canvas structure, she imagined the soldiers, the ones too hurt, too ill, or too isolated. They were the ones who truly needed the fantasy she carried. The thought was a sudden, sharp ache in her chest that eclipsed the pain of her fever. She realized that for 20,000 men, she had been a performance, but for the few isolated men, she needed to be a person. She reached the helicopter ramp. The door was already sliding open. An aide was ready to secure her harness. As she raised a foot to step aboard, she hesitated and looked back one last time toward the shadowy shape of that distant, lonely tent and the movement she had seen within. She knew with absolute certainty that her mission was not complete until she had acknowledged the men who were too gravely injured to come to her. She lowered her foot back to the frozen ground, her decision now solidified. The 6-minute window the general had mentioned was rapidly shrinking, and in that moment, Marilyn Monroe decided that her own safety was less important than a promise she hadn't yet made. The choice was no longer between her safety and the mission. It was between her fame and her soul, and Marilyn chose the latter. At the far, frozen edge of the base, while the cheers of 20,000 men still echoed faintly, there was only silence inside the darkened triage tent. These were the men who couldn't be moved, the ones whose conditions were too precarious to risk transporting them to the main show. They were the forgotten audience, and their regret hung heavy in the frigid air. For 1 second, as Marilyn's chopper prepared for takeoff, a sudden gust of wind caught the tent flap, pulling it back like a curtain. And for that brief, heart-stopping moment, the most famous woman in the world saw 3 profoundly lonely faces watching the lights of the departing crowd, realizing that the fantasy they craved had passed them by. Inside, Sergeant Miller lay motionless, his leg badly wounded by shrapnel just 2 days earlier. He wasn't in terrible pain anymore, but the disappointment was a separate, deep ache. He kept thinking about the pin-up picture of Marilyn he had tucked into his helmet. Next to him was Private Chen, a young man from a remote farming village, whose face was pale and drawn. He was suffering from severe frostbite, and the fear in his eyes wasn't about losing his toes. It was about the shame of not being able to continue serving his country. He kept asking the medic if the general would send him home, wondering if his life was essentially over at the age of 20. But the man who felt most broken was Lieutenant Davies. He was physically unharmed, but his eyes held a hollowness that no field dressing could cover. He was fighting deep exhaustion and the silent, corrosive battle of post-traumatic stress. He needed a distraction, a brief moment of beautiful, uncomplicated joy to pull him out of the terrible loop of his memories, and Marilyn's music had been his only hope. The 3 men hadn't spoken about missing the show, but the disappointment was palpable, hanging like the freezing condensation on the tent ceiling. They were supposed to be heroes, yet they felt like children who had missed the circus. The only connection they had to the joyous bass was the faint, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the helicopter blades now winding up for Marilyn's rapid departure. The medic, an older, tired-looking man, noticed the lieutenant's shaking hands. "She was incredible, boys," he whispered, trying to offer comfort. She sang 3 encores. But the words were weak against the growing sense of abandonment. Marilyn, standing with her foot still hovering above the helicopter floor, couldn't shake the image of those 3 faces. They were human beings whose fundamental right to simple joy had been robbed by circumstance. That single, fleeting glimpse was a call she couldn't ignore. The general's order suddenly meant nothing compared to the profound need she had just witnessed. She lowered her foot back to the cold ground, her decision now solidified. The wind screamed its warning, the general shouted his command, but Marilyn Monroe was about to ignore the fear of the blizzard and the rank of the general for the sake of 3 forgotten men. The wind was screaming now, a monstrous, high-pitched howl as the helicopter's rotor blades sliced through the frigid air, signaling an imminent departure. Marilyn was strapped into the uncomfortable canvas seat, the general's aide hurriedly clicking the final buckle, and the door was already sliding shut, sealing her in. This was the moment of no return. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, trying to steady the frantic beating of her heart. General Harlan was outside, giving the pilot the frantic final go signal. She closed her eyes, and instead of seeing the blinding spotlights, she saw the 3 lonely faces in the dark tent. In that deafening roar, a profound realization washed over her. She wasn't just defying a general, she was defying every studio boss who told her she was property. She had seen too much control in her life to surrender her heart now. The defiance was exhilarating. She knew she couldn't leave. With a sudden, powerful movement, she ripped the harness free, throwing the buckle against the metal frame. The aide stared at her, stunned. She leaned forward, using the fierce energy of her conviction, and grabbed the shoulder of the pilot. "Stop!" she commanded, pointing fiercely at the door. "You will open this door, now. The pilot looked desperately through the plexiglass at General Harlan. General Harlan had already started to turn away when he saw the door beginning to slide back open. He whirled back around, his face instantly transforming from relief to absolute crimson rage. He stormed back to the side of the chopper. "Miss Monroe, you are endangering this entire operation. I order you to reboard immediately." Marilyn looked him directly in the eye. The wind whipped her famous blonde hair around her face, momentarily masking her feverish exhaustion, revealing only a profound, stubborn determination. She didn't shout back. She simply lowered her voice to a dangerous, non-negotiable calm. "I have not completed my visit, General. My command comes from my own heart, and it tells me that I cannot leave until every man has been seen." With that, she stepped past the stunned general and began walking back. Not toward the cheers, but toward the distant cold darkness of the forgotten triage tent, leaving General Harlan standing alone on the windy tarmac, his military command defied by a single act of radical, selfless kindness. The general met her halfway on the slick, icy tarmac, his face a mask of scarlet fury that seemed to defy the freezing temperatures. The sound of the helicopter blades was the only witness. "You have just defied a direct order in a combat zone. You are putting the lives of your security detail, the pilot, and the entire mission at risk. What in the name of God do you think you're doing?" Marilyn surprisingly did not raise her voice. "General," she said, her voice strained but clear, "I came here for the troops. Not the 20,000 cheering men who will tell their families they saw me, but the men who needed me and couldn't leave their posts or their cots. My presence here is supposed to be about morale, and morale doesn't stop at the spotlight." The general sputtered, grabbing her arm with an urgency that bordered on desperation. "I am telling you, the storm is inbound. We have literally minutes. Your duty here is complete. You are a civilian, and you will return to the aircraft." "And who am I to tell them their duty is complete?" Marilyn countered, pulling her arm away with a sharp movement. "When I know there are 3 men lying over there who did their duty and now can't even stand to see the sun?" She pointed to the triage tent. "You see a security risk, General Harlan. I see 3 forgotten heroes. I don't take orders when my heart tells me I have promised something I haven't delivered." The sheer audacity, the confident rebellion of this famous civilian completely stunned the general. He was momentarily defeated, his military language failing him completely. He stood exposed on the open tarmac, his power evaporating in the wind. Marilyn gave him no chance to recover. She moved swiftly, pulling a heavy, borrowed military coat from the stunned aide and tossing it back at him. "The pilot has my command," the general finally managed, his voice now a frustrated growl. "He knows to wait only 3 minutes more, or he is authorized to lift off without you." Marilyn stopped, glancing back one last time. A soft, genuine smile, the one she never showed the cameras, touched her lips. "Then I suggest you come with me, General. You might learn something." With that, she turned her back on the helicopter. The general's military posture completely dissolved. His authority crumpled like paper, forced to follow the one woman who understood that the true purpose of a visit wasn't the number of people who cheered, but the depth of care shown to the few who couldn't. The contrast was immediate and profound. The icy wind and shouted orders of the tarmac gave way to the quiet, sterile warmth of the triage tent. Marilyn stepped inside, followed by a pale, silently fuming General Harlan, and the atmosphere shifted from military rigidity to a space of profound, vulnerable humanity. Marilyn ignored the general entirely. She took off her white fur boots, placing them neatly beside the cot of Sergeant Miller. Then, to the utter shock of the medic and the 3 soldiers, she gathered her thin dress and sat down on the floor next to the cot. She wasn't standing over them as a celebrity. She was sitting with them as a friend. "Hello, Sergeant," she whispered, her voice husky from the cold and the fever. "I am so sorry you missed the show, but you know, I think this is a much better stage anyway. It's certainly got the best audience." She didn't talk about Hollywood or fame. She asked them their names, where they were from, and what they missed most about home. She sat with Pert Chen, the young man struggling with frostbite, and asked him about his family farm, listening with genuine curiosity. She sat with Lieutenant Davies, the exhausted officer, and shared a nervous cigarette with him. She told him that she, too, often felt afraid when the cameras were off, confessing a small, genuine fear that she would never be taken seriously. Then she decided to give them their private performance. She stood, ignoring the pain in her feet and the throbbing in her head. She began to sing a quiet, a cappella version of a famous song, a haunting version of "My Heart Belongs to Daddy," changing the lyrics to "My Heart Belongs to Judy," weaving in the names of the men and her profound appreciation for their sacrifice. It was the most honest, purest performance of her entire life. It was a gift given with nothing expected in return. The medic had tears streaming down his face. Pivet Chen was smiling, a radiant, simple smile. And then there was General Harlan. He stood motionless just inside the tent flap. He had come in prepared to drag her out, but the sight of the world's biggest icon, sitting on a dirty canvas floor and singing to 3 injured men like she was singing only to them, completely paralyzed him. He had seen courage in combat, but he was witnessing a different kind of bravery. His eyes, fixed on Marilyn, were visibly welling up. Marilyn finished her song on a soft, resonant note. As the quiet settled, Lieutenant Davies, still shaken but feeling seen for the first time in months, shifted on his cot. He opened his mouth not to thank her for the song, but to reveal a much deeper wound, a pain that needed more than just a melody to heal. The soft echo of the private song had just faded when Lieutenant Davies shifted on his cot. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "My wife," he finally managed, his eyes fixed on the canvas ceiling. She sent me a letter, said she couldn't handle the distance anymore. The last thing she told me was that she didn't know the man who left home anymore, that I had changed." He paused, a single silent tear tracking a clean line through the grime on his cheek. "I'm not seriously harmed, Miss Monroe. I'm just broken. And I don't know how to go back and show her the good man I used to be." The confession hung in the air, a raw, exposed nerve. This was the true cost of the front lines. Marilyn didn't move. She didn't offer a platitude. Instead, she looked into his eyes and saw a familiar pain, the pain of feeling unseen and misunderstood. "Lieutenant Davies," she said softly, "do you know how many times people have told me that I'm not the woman they thought I was?" She reached out, placing her hand gently over his. "They call me an object. They tell me I don't have a mind. They talk about the money I make, the clothes I wear, and they forget that I spend half the night alone, reading poems and wishing someone would just see the nervous, sometimes very sad woman underneath all the lights." She leaned in, sharing her truth, bridging the impossible gap between the lonely star and the isolated soldier. "Lieutenant, sometimes, late at night in Hollywood, I fear that when the lights fade, no one will remember my real name, only the blonde fantasy. You are not broken. You are brave. You have seen things that changed you because you risked everything for people you don't even know. If your wife can't see the hero who returned, it's not because you changed. It's because she hasn't looked hard enough at the depth of who you've become." The vulnerability was mutual and profound. Marilyn had given a piece of her public persona to the 20,000 cheering soldiers, but she gave a piece of her soul to this man. In the corner, General Harlan stood rigid, but his hands were now lowered from his chest. He heard the intimacy in Marilyn's voice, the utter lack of performance, and he finally understood. This was not a security risk. This was a healer. Marilyn stayed silent for a long moment, simply holding the lieutenant's hand, offering him the deep, sustaining comfort of being truly seen. The general, watching this exchange, felt his own tightly controlled emotions begin to fray. With the lieutenant's pain acknowledged, Marilyn knew she had done what she came to do. A promise requires action, and she knew she had to leave them with something tangible, something that guaranteed their future was as bright as their sacrifice. Marilyn stood, brushing the dust and grime from the floor off her dress. The weight of the moment was immense. She turned, her famous face determined, and addressed the 3 men and the stunned medic. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that felt like a secret shared under oath. "I have friends in high places, General Harlan aside, and I am going to call every one of them." She explained her promise. For Private Chen, she would personally contact specialists to arrange a priority medical transfer back to the States for the best possible care, ensuring he would recover fully without shame. For Lieutenant Davies, she promised to leverage her connections to secure him a post-service job, one that focused on his mind, not his trauma, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. Then came the act that truly shocked the Army, an action so profound, so deeply personal, that it defied every expectation of celebrity and wealth. She reached up to her left hand and with a slight tremble began to pull something off her finger. It was her wedding band, the heavy gold ring given to her by Joe DiMaggio, a simple, heavy gold ring that represented a love story the entire world had been watching. It was an item of incalculable emotional and financial worth. She held the ring in her palm, its simple gold shimmering in the dim tent light, and placed it directly into the open, injured hand of Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant," she said, tears now filling her own eyes, "this ring is a symbol of a promise I treasure. I want you to hold it. Keep it close, under your pillow or in your pocket." Sergeant Miller stared at the gold, utterly overwhelmed, unable to speak. "I can't take this, Miss Monroe. It's too much." "It's not too much," she insisted, closing his fingers gently around the gold band. "It is a token of our commitment. The Army will evacuate you, but I want you to have my guarantee. You will send this ring back to me when you are fully recovered, back on your feet, and ready to live your fullest life, not before. That is the condition of my promise." The three men, the medic, the general, the soldiers, were all rendered speechless by the staggering intimacy of the gesture. She had given them the most valuable personal piece of her life as collateral against their recovery. General Harlan saw the ring, and in that instant, he understood he was not just guarding a secret. He was now guarding Marilyn's entire emotional history. "General," she said, her tone both a warning and a command, "I expect these men to receive the absolute best care. If I hear one whisper that my promise was broken, the whole world will hear about it." With that, she gave a soft salute, turned, and walked out of the tent and back into the raging blizzard, leaving behind the general and three soldiers holding a secret that would truly shock the Army, a secret sealed by a golden ring. The silence in General Harlan's office was absolute, a profound emptiness that rushed in immediately after the helicopter lifted off. The storm outside might have stopped, but the storm of self-reproach inside him was just beginning. He paced his small office, unable to reconcile the rigid world of command he knew with the boundless world of compassion he had just witnessed. He looked down at his own gold wedding band, a simple, plain band, and compared it in his mind to the sacred public treasure Marilyn had placed in a soldier's palm. His ring represented duty to one woman. Hers represented sacrifice for every man. His authority felt suddenly cheapened, worthless. He didn't waste time on regret. Instead, he channeled his shattered discipline into action. He was taught to manage war, but Marilyn had taught him how to manage humanity. He bypassed 3 levels of protocol, sending a coded telegram demanding the immediate transfer of the 3 men to the best surgical unit in Seoul, citing unforeseen strategic necessity. He specifically ordered psychological support for Lieutenant Davies, knowing the general could not afford to tell the Pentagon that he was taking orders from a movie star's intuition. He was scrambling, desperately covering the tracks of his own profound change. He sat down and began drafting a private report, not for the records, but for his own conscience. He chronicled every detail of the standoff, of Marilyn's quiet defiance, and of the astonishing ring. He knew this document would be classified and hidden forever, a secret testament to the moment the King of Hollywood surrendered her most prized possession, and in doing so commanded the highest ranks of the United States Army. The military base was still reeling from the weather when the 3 forgotten soldiers were suddenly treated like top priority casualties. Sergeant Miller, Private Chen, and Lieutenant Davies were evacuated first, before 2 field colonels who had been waiting 14 hours for transport. The shockwave wasn't just physical. It was institutional. The personnel couldn't fathom it. Why were these 3 minor casualties suddenly the most important men on the base? The story of the Monroe exception spread through whispers. A medic mentioned the private concert. A pilot mentioned the general's breakdown on the tarmac. The rumor had become undeniable. An outside force had broken the chain of command, and the chain of command was better for it. The actions of the officers provided external validation. They followed General Harlan's unprecedented orders to prioritize humanity over logistics. The general himself personally supervised the immediate transfer of the 3 men. The whisper that made the colonels nervous wasn't about the enemy. It was about the general's sudden, profound change of heart. They knew a precedent had been set, a higher moral law now governed their actions. The 3 soldiers were moved to a pristine field hospital near the coast, still receiving treatment far superior to standard issue. Their silence, their quiet dignity, and the secret knowledge of the gold ring bound them together. They left a base that had fundamentally changed in the silent aftermath of Marilyn's defiant compassion. They were finally on their way home, still holding the secret that they were now the 3 most important soldiers in the Army. The frantic, confusing noise of the military hospital in Seoul was eventually replaced by the quiet efficiency of a shared specialized recovery room in San Francisco. This was the peace they had fought for. Sergeant Miller, Private Chen, and Lieutenant Davies were recovering side by side, still bound by their impossible secret. They were receiving the best care, constantly talking about the gold ring and Marilyn's promise. They spent hours talking about the sheer fact that she had remembered them, and the gold ring was the focal point of their gratitude. They talked about her fever, her kindness, and the way she had looked into their eyes and seen not just soldiers, but human beings. The specialized care she arranged was healing them fully. Private Chen's specialized treatment ensured his complete recovery from the frostbite, guaranteeing his future was bright. Lieutenant Davies's counseling and purpose-driven recovery plan were giving him the courage to face his wife and his memories. They collectively agreed that the debt must be repaid perfectly. They would wait until they were all fully released and completely well, honoring the spirit of the promise. They drafted the perfect message, simple and profound. Finally, Sergeant Miller, fully recovered and ready to leave, packaged the gold ring with meticulous care. He knew this was the final act of keeping the promise, the last chapter of their shared Korean story. He placed the simple, single-sentence note inside the package and sealed it shut. Months later, the Korean cold was a distant memory. Marilyn Monroe was back under the blinding studio lights in Hollywood. She was struggling, exhausted by the endless demands of fame and the perception that she was only beautiful and frivolous. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, a small, anonymous package arrived in the mail. It was plain brown paper, sealed with simple tape, and addressed to her in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Her secretary almost tossed it, assuming it was fan mail. She tore the paper, her heart suddenly pounding. Inside the small box, nestled on a bed of simple cotton wool, lay a single item, the heavy, gold wedding band. Next to the ring was a small, folded note. Marilyn's hands were shaking as she unfolded the paper. There was no greeting, just a single, powerful sentence. "The promise is kept. We are standing tall, Miss Monroe." It was signed simply, "The Three." She stared at those 7 words, and the entire whirlwind of her celebrity vanished. That gold band, returned, was the greatest reward she had ever received. It was a tangible confirmation that her decision, the one that had risked her safety and defied a general, had been the right one. She sank onto her sofa, holding the note and the ring, and quietly let the tears flow. They were tears of pure, overwhelming catharsis. Sergeant Miller was back home, coaching a little league team, his leg healed. Private Chen was making a full recovery and going on to enroll in engineering school, and Lieutenant Davies had accepted the job she secured for him, writing copy for a film studio, rebuilding his life one honest word at a time. Their recovery was her most secret and greatest cinematic success. She kept the ring, not on her finger, but in a small velvet box on her nightstand. Her most powerful performance was never filmed. It existed only in the privacy of her heart, sealed by the quiet return of a gold band. The ultimate theme is simple: the difference between being famous and being important. The Army was shocked by her breach of protocol, but the truth is, they were shocked by the unprecedented purity of her human heart. The greatest stories are never about the flash. They're about the heart. If this moment of humanity behind the legend touched you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more stories. Don't forget to like this video to help us share Marilyn's incredible anonymous kindness with the world.